Hi, everyone. ¿Se sent? Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Elizaba, and welcome to the presentation of the new number of Temes de Disseny. Today we have an hour where we're going to be presenting you like the new number that it's just coming out, but also we're going to introduce you what's the new call for the next number that's come next. For the ones that you don't know, Temes de Disseny, it's a journal that tries to explore and create bridges between like young researchers and more like established researchers from national and international, and also tries to, especially speaking, bring design and research through design to the forefront of what research can be. This is a bit the goal of this journal. Already 4 years we've been trying to explore also new forms of communicating by adding different formats than the normal paper, like pictorials, case studies, and other forms that who knows what will come next. We are really happy with the way that the journal is going. More and more researchers are seeing Temes de Disseny as a valuable place to publish their work. From multiple countries and different universities are involved. And I think that we are also happy to see that practice designers also like see Temes de Disseny as a way of showing their speculations, their experiments in terms of what design can be. Today we are here to present number 37. And number 37, it's about invisible conflicts, a new terrain of bodies, infrastructures, and information. And I'm not going to explain you what it is about because we have actually the two guest editors that will explain you about them. But let me just introduce themselves briefly. So we have Bani Brusadin, who's an independent curator and researcher sailing on the travel waters where contemporary art, network technologies, popular cultures, and philosophies meet and sometimes clash. And we also have Laura Benitez, who's also an independent researcher and curator who connects philosophy, arts, and technoscience in her work. She's presently researching the practices of bioart, biohacking, processes of bioresistance, civil disobedience, my God, and non-human agents. It's complicated stuff, but super interesting, and that's why we wanted them to be like the guest editors of this number. We always try to combine people that think that are at the forefront of the topics that the numbers actually present, and in this case we are really happy to have them there. I think that the work has been amazing. It has been a pleasure to work with the two of you, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Oscar. Thanks again, Oscar and Laura and Guillaume for the invitation. It's been really a privilege and a pleasure to work with all of you. It's been honestly really a great process, and probably people are not interested in this, but we want to say this publicly because it's been like exemplary work for us. When we actually were discussing the initial brief, we were talking about the idea of researching practices of counter design or contestational design, and which shapes contestational design would assume would take in contemporary world. And immediately we faced a big challenge, because all of a sudden we realized that the traditional or well-known or established even forms of counter design were under huge pressure because the matter itself of conflict, of clash in society is changing. And basically the big challenge was, where is conflict and what is conflict in contemporary society? In our society, in our cities, but even at a larger scale, on the scale of the planet. And from then on, the challenge became bigger and bigger. We decided to approach this issue focusing on the idea of conflict in a world where there's no clear horizon for many different reasons. From our own human perspective, the horizon is shifting very much. The traditional rationalist horizon based on geometry, basically, on our perspective, our eyes, and our rational brain, is also fading away because we are living within a series of systems that are immensely complicated, are not visible, are not sensible for our poor five senses, and are extremely complex, so that even our individual brain is not able to grasp this complexity. And there's a lot of conflict there. But then there's also another reason why we decided to focus, to approach the idea of conflict in this way. Conflict is invisible also because it involves other agents, other users, other beings, other life forms, even those that our senses cannot fully perceive or understand or even notice. So the idea of invisible conflicts was going to take shape at this point. And we realized that we wanted to devote this issue about this idea of shape-shifting conflict. And we thought that there were many actually angles to this. We decided that we wanted to actually put together a call for authors, for contributors, that would allow for a wide range of researchers to tap in and send their contributions. And I guess that fortunately, the journal that we have here today is actually reflecting this in a nice way. We have a really broad range of contributions, some of which are really at the boundaries of design, which I think was the goal in a way. Because the idea is pushing these boundaries, questioning them, and that's what research is about, to finding something that is missing or that could be developed in a different way. When we are talking about invisible conflicts, of course, we had to focus on a number of issues and problems and themes that we try to condense and wrap up in the introduction. But there were just a few notions that immediately appeared to be like core and key to this proposal that this proposition that we actually posed to the possible contributors. One was the issue of scales. One of the reasons why conflict in our society, and even power structure, are hard to grasp is because they are enmeshed in scales issues. When I'm talking about scales, I'm not talking about the term of scalability. That is a quite useful and common term in terms of design practice. I'm really talking about scales in terms of time scales, space scale, and other scales that we may add. I'm talking about scales because when we're talking about power and conflict, we are dealing with things that are multi-layered, that are interconnected in very complex ways, and that actually embrace a very broad range of issues, from the infinitely small and tiny to the infinitely big, large, from atoms or even subatomic issues up to space or planetary issues. I'm talking about chemicals, and I'm talking about logistics, for instance, just to give a few basic examples, right? And all the issues we wanted to touch upon actually involved all the different scales here, from the very small to the huge. And we can talk about time, which is more the same, from the very slow, the deep time of geological evolution, up to the incredibly fast and even hard to perceive, like, I don't know, financial transaction or any kind of data transaction in the current setup of network society. The obvious consequence of this approach was that approaching these kind of issues in this way, we would not fall into like the usual reaction that we more and more commonly face when we are talking about these issues. We are tiny little human beings, most of the time atomized in front of our screens. what can we do in front of this huge scenario, this huge beast that we cannot control? We did not want to fall into that kind of approach, and we actually wanted to explore all the creases, all the cracks, the bends, the irregularities of this hugely complex scenario. We think that research should focus not on the monolithic nature of this situation, these circumstances, but rather on the possibilities that emerge in these cracks that are actually quite likely the structural composition of this situation. When we're talking about huge internet infrastructures, for instance, when we approach them, when we focus, when we zoom in, we realize that it's not a monolith. It's actually a very uneven composition of different setup, different standards, power struggles, inconsistencies, errors, or lack of maintenance. There's a lot of irregular situations there that actually allow to step in and actually see how these systems work. And we found this approach quite useful and stimulating to actually have a practical way to approach these problems instead of just feeling mesmerized and totally powerless in front of this. In the introduction, we mentioned as a very basic example, not actually a very novel one, the Amazon fulfillment centers. Probably you know about it already because it's a very well-known case study. We found that the Amazon storage system, that actually is much more than a storage system. That's why they call it fulfillment centers, because they needed a new word, a new phrasing for that, was a great example of that. It's some sort of algorithmic architecture, an operative landscape where terminals are key as mediators in what happens in these fulfillment centers, and where there's some agency in systems rather than humans. People working, I don't know, maybe you know someone working in the Amazon center in El Prat, and probably this person will tell you that they just follow instructions, they are terminals, they produce data, paradoxically. It's crazy. It's very unclear, the distinction between a worker and a producer. And when we actually live in a digitally mediated world, we do the same, more the same. We are sometimes in the position of users, sometimes in the position of consumers, sometimes in the position of producers of something, of even worker in a way. There's a very nice paradox that I like to mention when I talk about these things. The task of driving a car or driving a van was usually considered like a very low skill job, because it was stupid, it was dumb, it was adding no value to the good transported by the van. Nowadays, the situation is reversed. The driver is actually teaching, learning, training a system to understand how life is on the streets of Barcelona. And that's a very valuable aspect of the work of the driver. They are teaching the future system of automated driving systems of tomorrow. And it's interesting as a paradox, because what was a very low skill, low value job has become an interesting and valuable job in the current context. I'm mentioning this aspect and the Amazon fulfillment centers because you may have the feeling that this idea of invisible conflict is very abstract. It's like almost philosophical. And of course, there is a very important and very serious philosophical side to this, but it's also extremely practical, and that's why design should be part of the game. Because we are talking about a huge Copernican change in the way we understand a city, urban design, for instance, but also unionism. I mean, it's obvious. The role of unions in such a scenario may change completely. But it's not only material, it's also about imagination, fantasies, dreams. It's about love, you know? All these mediators between lovers, people who try to flirt and have sex through a platform. We should not be, of course, moralists in this sense, but we should notice that there's something going on. Our mind, our desire, our ambitions and expectation are also changing in this scenario. So it's a very complex mesh of things, both material and immaterial. And so that was basically the initial, statement, the first approach to the call. And then things moved on.
I'm the things. No, just kidding. So just want to say again, thank you very much to Oscar, Laura, and Gim for inviting us and for the opportunity to of Temes de Disseny, and also I just want to remark, to share in public this grateful kind of a statement, also for the political commitment of working on an open access journal, that I think that it's something extremely important when we are referring to knowledge making, and knowledge transfer. So I'm retaking this for us. I mean, this idea of the paradox in this number. I mean, paradox and conflicts. The relation, if you want, it seems pretty obvious in a way, but the consequences in what we call this realm of reality, it seems at least, a bit more complicated. So, for example, for us, it was pretty important to try to articulate some critical tools, some of them conceptual, some of them pragmatical ones, working on the problems related to, for example, fiction as a tool. Fiction and speculation, both tools, if you want to say so, pretty present in design practices. So, for example, fiction, of course, it has kind of a power in terms of potential to open up this kind of cracks that Bunny was mentioning before, in order to produce critical knowledge, critical tools, to imagine different possibilities. But at the same time, or simultaneously, also fiction can work as something that erases conflicts, or can make conflicts more difficult to, at least to realize. So, for example, one of the most, let's say, pretty common fictions that it seems that operates in a hyper-real dimension is, for example, borders. Borders are geopolitical and historical fictions with hyper-real consequences. People is getting killed every day because of this fiction, because of how this fiction operates. So, for example, for us, this kind of paradoxes were pretty important in order to work on the visible realm, the visual regime, when we are able to point out and to remark conflicts, and we are not able to do it, and why? Why are the reasons that are, working there? So, for us, this potential and at the same time inherent problematics of fiction were important, and mainly I think that we have this kind of opportunity because of, working on an issue, mainly focus on design practices, precisely because design is also producing, for example, philosophical knowledge, but from practice, not this kind of abstraction in theoretical terms, but you, the designer ones, you are working within matter, from matter, on matter, and materiality. And by doing that, you are producing also not just critical tools, but critical thinking. different critical approaches to what we call reality. And also, you are producing different, let's say, critical approaches in order to identify conflicts that maybe are not so common or are not so present in our daily life. So for us, that was also a super important point. For example, also was important for us in order to cope with invisible conflicts, all the parameters that are operating in, you know, like our cultural background. And when I say our, of course, I'm referring to Western culture that we know, we are pretty aware that is cultures in plural, but the thing is that for us it was pretty important to remark also all the problems that we are dealing or coping with. For example, the fictional split in between nature and culture, and also the hyper-real consequences in philosophy, in history, in politics, and of course also in design practices. So also, I mean, in that sense, for us was pretty important to try to work, but on these problems, but from design practices, not on the design practices, but from the design practices, on this kind of problematics. Like, for example, these parameters on the visual regime and also on the visible realm, and at the same time to ask, maybe with no closed answer, or at least not yet, to ask, how can we, I mean, how can we could cope with every time that we are trying to represent something, at the same time we are adding some, let's say, layers of complexity that maybe can turn this perception of the conflict even more. We were trying to reflect on a way from a critical perspective on these issues, and
what you're saying here is very interesting, because one of the things that we also mentioned briefly in the introduction, and we did it because it was a very hot topic for us, was about visibility. Yeah. And visibility is another of those paradoxes that we encountered. We discussed a lot about this, and realized that most often things are very visible today, and I'm trying to be very general here, but we are like flooded by images, information, details, background information, archives, etc., etc. And at the same time, this extra visibility, this hyper visibility, is actually hiding something from us. And this is another really important paradox. We don't want to stick to paradoxes. We think it's just one specific step in a process, but realizing these paradoxes is really useful at some point, as well as when we were talking about this idea of invisible conflict. We're talking about abstraction, and we are surrounded by very abstract rules, systems, and set of systems at any time. Here on our phones, these are terminals, and probably we are also terminals of very abstract systems of systems. But at the same time, through these very same interfaces, we are actually flooded by a huge amount of details, of tiny details. So we are kind of forced or pushed towards details, but in the back end of these systems, abstraction is actually working. So another paradox, and we didn't want to stop there. We wanted to, okay, we realized, we acknowledge this paradox, but what's next? And design practice was, hopefully, that was our hope, could actually provide ways to go beyond the paradox, to see actual cases, actual situation and circumstances where these things are operating and can be unpacked or even counter or redesigned. That was Of course, when you actually send out a call for contributors, you don't know what's coming back to you. You cross your fingers and you hope that your beautiful ideas, or hopefully beautiful, actually resonate with someone else's work. Okay, I think that we were happy and actually really grateful for the contribution that we had, because most of the contribution that we had, especially those that were selected and shortlisted for the final publication, were actually avoiding technocratic solutions, like technology is good, let's use technology to fix problems. That at this point in history, we know is a very limited approach to these things. But the contributions were also avoiding technophobia. Like, let's get back to nature, let's rediscover our authentic self as human beings. We're not interested in that either. It doesn't make any sense. And also, there was not even a hint on, at least that's my perception, of like approaches like technology could be really bad, but can also be very good. Let's design technology at a human scale, a humane scale. What's the human scale? And are we really sure we want to have more human scale in this kind of problems? Probably the reason why we are here is the human scale. Probably we need different scales. So in the end, we tried to actually put together some contributions for the publications that actually talked about agency, but also trying to find a new definition of agency, not the usual human agency that is reflected in democratic processes, but something slightly different, slightly more complex, and in tune with the kind of challenges that we are facing. We try to suggest that probably we should imagine different kind of systems based on data. We kind of flirted in a way with the idea of surveillance capitalism. Obviously, it's very apparent nowadays. But we thought that that concept was very much, and some of the authors actually were on the same line. We believe that the approach based on the notion of surveillance was very much dependent on the idea of individual. Someone is surveilling me, my data. And our approach was, and who cares about your data? Data can be good. The actual situation is probably not very interesting because it's basically a huge system of extraction of value from individual data, but we may imagine different systems where individual data are not interesting, where identity is not solidified as it is today. Facebook forces you to use your own name, for instance, just a tiny example, right? Identity are solid there. What if we can imagine some data systems where identities are diluted instead of solidified? And then data can become interesting. Data for understanding climate change or to counter unjust policies, etc. Right? So that was the approach. And we kind of summed it up in the title of our introduction, which sounds really bombastic, but like the challenges of design on a planetary scale. And we didn't mean that designers should conquer the world and redesign it. Probably nobody should, at least nobody alone, and not from one single field. But the idea of planetary scale was actually key to understand that problems are interrelated. And you need alliances to actually face the challenges that we are facing.
I just wanted to add that this reference to planetary scale, it was kind of a, let's say, a kind of a way in order to say and to point out the attention, not being stuck in the paradox, but staying with the trouble in terms of Donna Haraway, like dealing and coping with complexity instead of simplifying things, no? And what kind of be articulated from there.
Maybe go through the articles, just very briefly.
Yeah, yeah.
As you can see, we are kind of passionate about these things. It's not yet another job. We really felt it. Okay, so I'll actually follow the, I don't know if you have it in front of you. Well, otherwise, maybe I forgot to move from slide to slide. I was very happy to add this image. This image is from the Arecibo antenna. It's a huge antenna in Central America, which at some point last year just collapsed. It was a very nice image, all these, other forms of life taking over again, but sorry. So this is like the table of contents of the journal, right here. So the first contribution has a very, kind of provocative title. It's called Green Military New Deal by Eduardo Castillo Vinuesa and what's her name? Sorry. And Julia Gankiewicz. Green Military New Deal. Basically, the authors, actually, that's a very good example. Oh, super. Thanks. Green New Deal, okay, we are kind of familiar now with this proto-concept or proto-policy, as the authors call it. But they suggest a green military New Deal. And that's interesting because they are speculating about the role that the armies and military could actually take in policies countering climate change, which is kind of provocative. But we thought that this approach was very interesting. That's why we decided to publish it in the very first place of this issue, because we thought that this was a great example of design thinking, a research proposal that is completely counterintuitive. I mean, really, the army? It's the least sector of society that I would actually trust to deal with climate change. It is counterintuitive, but it, in a way, is also like a stress test for something that we really know. And in this article, they are talking about this scenario, this proposal, where something that we know is put in a very awkward and strange position. And it forces us to reimagine or re-see our own society as something weird and uncanny. This concept of the uncanny valley about robots, is one of the concepts in robotics. Uncanny valley is just like the shape of this sort of a diagram. At some point, robots are funny, and at some other point, robots are weird and scary. Well, just before they become like us. So that's the uncanny valley, when robots are really uncanny. What if we see our own society, our own technology, our own way of living as uncanny? It's some sort of anthropologic experiment in a way, and that's what the Green Military New Deal is about. And of course, as you will read, it's not fiction. They actually design the military of the future, which is not based on nations. It's publicly controlled and owned, and it's the only and main mediator between society as we know it and climate change. That's kind of, uncomfortable proposition, right? Then we have, it's time to relax. It's the second article in this issue. It's time to relax. The critical importance of digital mental health products in the context of surveillance capitalism. Now for something completely different. We're talking about apps dealing with mental health. We really wanted to have really different topics and different approaches in this issue. So we were not scared. Unfortunately, Laura, Oscar, and Gim were not either. Good for us. By the huge variety and diversity of topics touched upon in this issue. So in this article by Sena Partal and Sasha Smirnova, they were talking about mental health apps, especially during the pandemics, the lockdowns, etc. And they did not just say and analyze them as part of surveillance capitalism, which is kind of obvious, but they were also trying to figure out how these data could actually become something valuable for the people, not just some way of extracting value from that. And they did through like some sort of analysis of these apps and the market behind them, and how these apps work, and what kind of behaviors they actually foster, and how artificial intelligence is involved in this. Then we have the third article is a case study as the first one, and it's a really dense and mind-blowing piece called Air, From Radical Individuality to Connected Subjectivity. The title sounds like very philosophical, but the actual article is about a project made by 3 designers, Elisa Cuesta, Maria Victoria de la Torre, and Pedro Arnanz, who actually engaged with a design process because they actually designed some sort of a breathing machine connected to Twitter data. They built it. It was like a breathing body in a room. That was a project, their case study. But to get there and to shape this design project, they engaged in systemic thinking. They rethought what agency is. They found metaphors for that. They found an interesting metaphor related to fluids. And they said that the agency is something that flows through a social body. And then they redefined the idea of closeness, basing their thoughts on theoretical investigation about closeness in terms of like geographical or topological closeness, affinity, etc. And they adopted those concepts to explain communication on social media. And from there on, they built some kind of body made of membranes full of air that actually inflates and deflates depending on the flow of data. It's not just yet another example of data visualization. It's a way of reimagining distance, closeness, and agency in this way. It's a totally tentative. It's an assemblage of methods, how to actually grab data, process them, how to build this, how to theoretical frame it. But it's a great example, I believe, that philosophical and abstract and theoretical thought apply to design making, and how design making is actually influencing and improving thought at the same time.
Yeah, well, very briefly, because unfortunately we are running out of time. The next one is pictorial. Is Mari Mutare, a project by Vanessa Lorenzo, a project that is a speculative design and trans hack feminist proposal that works taking the figure of the green man, that this kind of figure that it's a hybrid of human and plants, and that represents in a way this nature-culture continuum, no? So it's a project that from a speculative design and experimental practices deal with precisely pretty complex notions and the hyper-real consequences of these notions, such as subjectivity, agency, but from these practices working mainly with prosthetics, bioprosthetics, if you want to say so, and also working with biology and biotechnology from an experimental perspective, from a critical design practice, no? And also, I just wanted to add, because I was thinking about it, or that, for example, this kind of practices and even this issue is a pretty clear example of how we are trying to go beyond or move beyond the human perspective and to think of and to deal with different scales. And at the same time or simultaneously, we are trapped in a kind of a anthropocentric perspective. And it shouldn't be something that we are not stuck. We are just trying to, like staying with the trouble, like dealing with complexity and also with the different layers of, let's say, critical possibilities. So that was the pictorial by Vanessa Lorenzo. The next project is co-designing meaningful dialogues on sexual harassment by Dina Ben Brahim. Sorry if I'm not spelling in a proper way the names. And here we have a proposal that pretends or wants to articulate from a design perspective and a design practice a creative experience that facilitates and creates or generates let's say the material conditions in order to facilitate dialogue, ideation, and agency for the once self-identified women, precisely to reclaim this safety that unfortunately so many times in a daily life in different geopolitical territories for different reasons, and of course as a consequence of a multiplicity layers of systemic and structural violence, we are feeling pretty insecure and not safe. So how design and design practices can also develop tools in order to generate these spaces for example, cares, no? This kind of notion of cares from a feminist perspective, and also implemented from a design practice. So the next one is also disappearing bodies, disappearing objects, what years and years can teach us about design by Saul Pandelakis. And also this proposal is a pretty interesting one, as all of them are, that works on, it takes this case study of years and years, probably you all know pretty well, years and years. And it works on the possibility on how design practices can work with narrative tools, with storytelling, and can use these tools in order to reality, or what we call present, but in order to articulate and re-articulate not just the, for example, the plausible futures, but to articulate the possible, in order to re-articulate at the same time what we call present. So it works on the possibility of working with, like taking the potency or the potential of utopia, futures, temporality, in order to work on critical prototyping. And it's a pretty rigorous, let's say, approach to in design and consensus, resistance and counter-resistance, design practice as common project process for plural possibilities on being and becoming, super short title, by Chiara Del Gaudio, Samara Tanaka, and Douglas Onzi Pastori. And also, this proposal deals precisely with how we can, okay, sorry, thanks. Precisely this possibility of coping with complexity, what it means to work on design practices, a speculative one, the critical ones, for example, how institution operates there and how the institutionalized practices also operate there, and how can we, for example, can articulate or can cope with resistance and also the generation of these cracks that Bunny was mentioning before, in terms of power in the best sense of the term, in terms of potential. And the next one is harnessing conflict, antagonisms, and spatio-temporal design practices by Roger Paez and Manuela Balchanova. And also in this particular case, they have a super interesting approach, taking some different case studies in order to work on hierarchical and de-hierarchicalization, hegemony, counter-hegemonic practices and proposals. And in this, let's say here, for example, it's pretty interesting how agency, again, reappears in terms of active citizenship, active participation, and also all the city-making, all the pluralities that we should take into account when we are, trying to deal with the complexities that we can find in all the configurations of public space, for example.
And very briefly, with the two last articles in this issue. One is a pictorial about by Matthias Schäfer, who is actually reversing the process of extraction of data in facial recognition. And most interestingly, this contribution is actually delving into the idea of using counter design and critical art to actually propose new visualization of this problem, which is most of the times hard to grasp. And the title is This Person Does Exist. Some of you may be familiar with a website which is called This Person Does Not Exist, which is the creation of artificial faces done by artificial intelligence systems. And he reverses that. And he actually goes down archaeologically extracting or actually excavating the artificial intelligence process back to the original face in the original data set. And the last piece of this issue is the Digital Sublime, Orientation Strategies for a Vertiginous World by Alejandra Lopez Gabrielidis and Tony Navarro. And this article basically, through the term digital sublime, is dealing with the idea of, overwhelming representation of things through images or through other aspects that actually lack signification, another paradox. When we're facing these huge systems, huge complexities, we probably feel something similar to the sublime, to the notion, a very classical aesthetical notion of sublime. And so the authors suggest that we need a new aesthetics, or a new aestheticization, not in superficial terms. Aesthetics as something related to our senses, to our possibility, to the really intimate and basic possibility of perceive and sense something that goes beyond our senses. And that's the proposal, a digital sublime to reconnect bodies, to actually foster emancipation instead of lack of agency, and actually to be able to work better on governance of these systems. So that was the last contribution. As you can see, the range of topics, approaches, methodologies, really broad. And I think we were really grateful for this opportunity, because there are not many journals, scientific journals, that are taking this risk. And Temes de Disseny is one of the few ones that we know that actually have the courage to approach these things in a not very strictly academical way, even though the quality is there. I mean, there's a lot of research in here. It's just done under different parameters. Probably more closer to the world of design in a way. So I don't know if there's any, probably we are running very late or, it's fine.
Hello? Ah, yes. Well, hi. Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate you as well. I mean, for this excellent work and for this vertiginous, overwhelming number. And for the quality, as you were saying, the quality, the research, just mentioning that Temes de Disseny is a peer-reviewed journal, so it's double-blinded review. So that means that Gim, who is the managing editor, is responsible of scouting all over the world international reviewers for the number, so a specialist in the topic. So that's besides guest editors and this scouting of reference reviewers, is what also makes this journal what it is, obviously the contributors. And well, I think it's mainly where you find these numbers. So as Laura was mentioning, it's open access, and you have the latest numbers. So number 37, you have it in research.elisava.net, where you can download the full number, like the digital version of this. Then you have all the 37 numbers in tdd.elisava.net. That means that we've been 37 years publishing this journal. The latest editorial managers being 4 years ago, but that means that you can go back, 37 years back. And you have also soon coming available to you the shop.elisava.net, where you can buy the printed version just for the sake of all the work in terms of printing, and that's it, okay? So that's where you can find it. For those who came here and joined us, you'll have a copy outside where you can take it for you to read it, to experiment, to understand what's the conflict and how design is working through this area. And then we have a new one, a new call for papers for number 38. The title, you see it here, it's Caring Through Design, From Personal to Planetary Well-Being, okay? The guest editors are Ana María del Corral, Elisabeth Silvestre, and Ricardo Guasc. So what does this mean? You have the call for papers on our website, you can Google it. But things or questions like, can design promote healthcare, building bridges between personal and planetary well-being? Can design be an active and positive tool in creating spaces where life can develop in all its dimensions and in balance with the biological systems? And also, is it time to consider health and well-being from a global perspective and approach caring for people, the environment, and its ecosystems under the umbrella of One Health? So we invite those who are joining us online, those who are here, and any other contributors to this topic. Just recalling that the journal is in 3 languages, so you can submit your contributions in any of the 3 languages. And of course, the final number is in 3 languages for those who, and I think it's one of the few, and Gim says that, few journals that have these 3 languages. So we invite everyone for this call, and I think it's mainly time for you and the ones who join us online for questions. So please, you have anyone? You're not conflicted with something that you want to share? Okay. No questions online yet? I have many questions, but I could ask you. Yes.
thanks so much for your presentation. Sounds really fascinating. I can't wait to dive in. Question about your maybe your curatorial process. Is there any invisible conflicts that you hadn't envisioned when you crafted the theme that kind of emerged from the contributions?
Well, if I may actually say that this is not strictly a curatorial process. Of course, there is some kind of curatorship at the beginning when you actually outline the main topic, but it's a very careful and delicate job because you cannot impose your own ideas on that. You should deliver your intuition, your interest, but not in a way that is actually enclosing, and that's a delicate issue. So you really need to stay open to contributions. And some of the contributions were really surprising. For me personally, one is especially surprising for its complexity, which is air, from radical individuality to connected subjectivity. And if you read this article, you will realize why. Because it's really like a roller coaster between physics and sociology and design, material design, etc. So probably for me it was kind of a challenge. Something that I did not expect in full, even though I was personally very interested in this kind of approaches, was the first piece, the first article about the Green Military New Deal. I have to confess that I knew about this idea from before, and I secretly hoped that the authors would apply to this issue of Temes de Disseny, and they did. So I was really grateful, and so it was not a surprise for me. When we received it, it was certainly a surprise for me when I first knew about the project. Because it's really challenging to think about something that we think we know, like the military and their role in society, and how we can actually subvert it and change it completely and flip it even. Of course, that's interesting because, for me, because it questioned the usual approach to speculative design. Yeah. That was really important for me, even though we didn't put in the call, but in the end it was there anyways. Because I've been engaging in speculative design a little bit, even though it's not my field, but I've been engaged practically in this, and I think that most of the time speculative design comes to the definition of a scenario, a very complex scenario sometimes, but in a way the process that brings you there is actually enhancing and magnifying your own bias, your own position, and your own lack of knowledge. Future is probably impossible to predict. And when you try to do it, inevitably, you tend to actually mirror the present into the future, or your desires, your expectations, your hopes, etc. That's why I found usually speculative design very troubling, really problematic. And I found that this article, Green Military New Deal, is playing with speculation in a completely different way. It doesn't care about viability. It doesn't care about plausibility either. But it's still very solid, really grounded. And that's why it's also an academic article, because there's an argument, there is a justification of that position. And so I found it very interesting because it opens up a different approach to speculative design, which is not just building a new world, like it was Minecraft or like it was my own dream. It's something that resembles the actual world that we live in, with little, tweaks and little changes actually that change the face, the appearance of our own world dramatically.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in this particular case, Bunny knew about it, but I didn't. So it took me 3 readings to realize that it was a critical approach. took me 3 readings because I found myself fighting, you know, like, okay, I'm not sure if they are trying to, you know, like to articulate a kind of a military narrative. So what is happening here? And this kind of challenge is is pretty interesting for the reasons that you were mentioning right now, because also it brings not just let's say, a different way to work with speculative tools, but also, by extension, it opens up new or different critical tools from this kind of approach. So in this particular case,
I was also thinking of the second pictorial, this person does exist. That was also interesting because in a way it set the stakes high for design research, saying that a database can be the subject matter of design research, which is counterintuitive. You know, databases are something that related to computer science. It's just for computer engineers. Why design should deal with interfaces at most, or the usage of these tools. What if there's something interesting for a designer within the database? In this case, a database of faces, and a database that includes some of the parameters that make faces interesting for face recognition automatic processes. That's interesting, because it definitely is a design procedure. It is. And so that was interesting for me because you can find conflict there. And probably something that in other fields has been researched already. But I think that it's worth posing these issues, these questions in a design environment and see what can we do about it.
Okay, thanks for that answer. I think we have more questions there. Meanwhile, big thanks from Dina Ben Brahim. She's saying hi online.
Hello, hi. Thank you for the presentation. It might be a silly question, but I was just wondering why this theme was this year's topic. If you found it relevant to 2021, all these things, themes about data, and I mean what the title says, the new terrain of bodies, infrastructures, and information. Maybe it's not your decision, but I don't know if why it's relevant to this year, for example.
Well, Laura, you can actually step in if you want, but the topic is something that is very much related to Laura's and my own research. So it sounded kind of, the logical proposition for us to make. I've been personally involved in research, probably more from the art production side and media theory, about conflicts that have communication and technology and communication technologies at the forefront for many, many years. And at some point I realized that the usual idea of guerrilla communication, contestational art, were actually losing ground to the huge shifts, tectonic shifts in contemporary society. So I naturally went towards that direction. And I'm not talking for Laura, but Laura has been working a lot on the idea of agency, non-human agency, and art practice about all this. So I think it sounded kind of natural to go in that direction. Then inevitably, this issue were conceived in a pandemic year, something completely novel for all of us, or most of us, I guess. And in fact, there are a few contributions that deal with COVID in a quite explicit way. AIR, which stands also for artists in residence or artists in remoteness, but also, of course, it's time to relax about mental health apps, which actually got a huge hype in the last 18 months or so. So the answer is yes and no at the same time.
Can I add here, I think, a word from, I think, Gim and Oscar. In terms of topic, we have an editorial board that each year we appoint them, asking them what would be the topic they would like to address for the following year. That's a starting point also for the new numbers. So this year, so each year we appoint them, we find their opinions, we meet internally and finally decide what could be the topic for that year. I was personally attached to this topic. I called it some other way, less fancier and less academic way. But this idea that design is not doing something, but we should be having this idea of activism or conflict or addressing things in a different way, in an academic way, and being kind of pushing, like Bunny was saying, pushing the boundaries. But obviously the topic decision is made based on editorial board and internally with main editors. And then of course, from a pool of network of excellence and contributors and their knowledge and their profiles and how we want quality to be embedded in the journal. So that's why Bunny and Laura were appointed. And again, with this excellent number, is pushing the boundaries of quality of the journal. So thanks. And I think we don't have any more questions online. Just a big thanks again. And as I said, you have the digital version online and the physical one for those who have been here with us. So thanks a lot.